Okay, our final session before lunch. Very lucky to have Right Honourable Lord David Willetts, Chair of the Regulatory Innovation Office, deliver a keynote address on how the RIO can accelerate growth in high value sectors. So over to you, Lord Willetts.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join you guys. And I've just been hearing all the stuff we're doing, and it was a challenge, but it was also encouraging to know that already Rio is appreciated and understood. So our job is quite simply to focus on on examples, on problems where regulations stand in the way of innovation and new technologies. And often that means tackling specific problems, but also you often need some kind of regulatory framework. So also we're happy to promote sensible regulation. We're not total minimalists. We have 4 priority areas for our first. We're just coming to the end of our first year. I've been chairing it for 6 months. When we started, ministers set 4 particular priority areas for us, which are drones, engineering biology, space, particularly space launch, and 4th, kind of medtech, particularly AI for medicine. And our approach, focusing on specific technologies and specific problems, absolutely matches the excellent approach of this centre, because I do think what the Centre for Sectoral Economic Performance is doing and the specific substantive reports it produces on key areas of technology and key business sectors is just what we need. There's a lot of general talk about industrial strategy. We need to make everything granular and focus on particular problems. I think, thinking back a long time to my time as minister, and it's great to see a very distinguished former minister, David Sainsbury, here. I often found that it was the technology roadmaps which some experts assembled are in a particular area that really help guide you as a minister to what you should do. Some of what we do is quite simply fighting particular problems. Sometimes it's dismissed. Some civil servants regard it as whack-a-mole, but I don't mind whacking a few moles when they are genuine regulatory problems that need to be tackled. And you've already heard an example, and let me just flesh that out. I mean, software as a medical device is a very tricky area. I've been hearing for years ministers. I remember Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor being excited about ambient AI being used so that GPs didn't have to draft letters to consultants after a patient consultation. It would all have been prepared for them using AI. The fact is that the regime for software's medical uses is still not clear. There's a rather ad hoc mix of sometimes it's accepted it's not a medical device. Other times it is regarded as a medical device. When you regard it as a medical device, you then have to fill in the questionnaire, including the key question, if this goes wrong, could a patient die? And if you tick that box, you will count as a class 3 medical device. And I have met innovators and investors who say, well, if we see class 3, we give up. We know there is not actually going to be able to make progress. And the MHRA are on side. The MHRA would not deny any of this. And we are now working yet again to try to get clear, practical, useful guidelines about the circumstances in which software is regulated as medical and what the rules are to get through that process. Something else in engineering biology is the fraught issue around GM, and we're not opening the overall GM debate. Many of us have scars on our back from that. But there is already some progress with the precision breeding legislation passed through the last Parliament, with now some regulations following. And again, where we can get closely involved is advising and helping promote a debate, because the old regulations are written around contained use versus deliberate release. And I think the model then was contained use equals a lab and deliberate release equals a field. But nowadays, containers can take a range of different forms. Why can't we think a little bit more imaginatively about what constitutes containment? Could you even imagine circumstances where a field was so effectively policed that it constituted contained release? So we are working with the regulators on issues like that. So if there are startups that have moved on from when this debate first happened almost 20 years ago, with imaginative interpretations of contained use, provided that the fundamental requirements of safety are met. We're up for engaging with that. We're also supporters of new regulation in new technologies where they are needed. I was very pleased, actually, by then I was in the Lords and a backbencher, but we got an advantage in space launch with the 2018 regulation. You need the aerospace regulation for lift does not cover trying to launch rockets into orbit using thrust. So we needed a regulatory regime. It's good that we've got one. We're now in a race between the north of Scotland, the north of the Shetland Isles, and Norway and Sweden as who gets the new market for launching small satellites into LEO orbit, often polar. And suddenly you realize that it's not just equatorial launch now, it's also smaller satellites in polar launch. And again, although overall the 2018 legislation is a good thing, it does have some features that are tiresome. It does have some of the liability rules have proved to be a constraint. There's a process of amending that already going through Parliament. We're up for looking and listening to what the industry says about getting the details of the regulation of space launch so that licensing is not onerous. The Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority is a fantastic national asset. It is probably still regarded as the world's leading regulator in that space. But again, they're starting to talk to us about areas where further legislation or regulation or amendment might be needed, in areas such as embryology, where now we are beginning to think of embryos not created from a fertilized egg, but from a pluripotent stem cell. Do they count as embryos? Is the first question. You often find that when you dig into these, getting the terminology clear is another area where you can help. Often the innovators say just the problem is the uncertainty about exactly what the regulations mean. In AI, what is it exactly to be anonymized? How can you be confident? What constitutes anonymized data? So we try to help by promoting clarity where that is what regulators need. We certainly support mutual recognition. We don't need to do everything ourselves. There was one observation that, because of course that's where the small countries have an advantage. If you look at what Estonia does or Singapore does, they don't claim they have their own domestic regulatory regime. They use regulatory approvals from other countries. We can learn from them. Someone said of Europe that Europe consists of small countries and countries that don't yet realize they're small. So there are lessons for all of us in accepting and learning from regulations and applying regulations from abroad. What are the issues? Let me try to take you through some of our frustrations and areas where we're trying to do more work. I would say my biggest single, let me go straight into my biggest single frustration, which is not a criticism of individual regulators, by and large. We are not in a state of war with the regulators. We have no legal powers to overturn a regulator. My job is to work with regulators, reporting, of course, to ministers who are very committed on this. And I have to say the Chancellor personally is clearly very committed. So that gets you a hearing, but you have to work with them. And what I have observed is that the regulators work within a particular area of expertise, and it's very hard for them to formulate regulations taking account of all benefits and all risks. And we either have to broaden the responsibilities of individual regulators, so expect them to do the whole lot, or we need some kind of scrutiny and supervision where it is legitimate to overrule a regulator because the balance of benefits and risks is greater than one regulator can take account of. And I think it'd be great if we had a cabinet committee or something that took account of these. People ultimately have to be democratically accountable for those decisions. But to give you an example from one of our 4 priority areas, drones. And as I said, this is no criticism of the CAA, but it's just a report on how the world is. So they regulate drones, and they're worried about the use of airspace and drones colliding with helicopters or drones colliding with light aircraft, and they all know all about airspace and those risks. And they report to the Department for Transport. Separately, in the DWP is the Health and Safety Executive, which covers workplace accidents. There are 50 fatalities a year as a result of workplace accidents. The biggest single cause of those fatalities is falling from a height. If we could use drones instead of people on ladders to inspect pylons and tall buildings and wind turbines, we could reduce the fatalities that are currently occurring. Where in the system is there an assessment about the benefits from lowering workplace fatalities as against the risks of a collision with a helicopter? Can we reasonably ask the CAA to take all that into account as part of its work, which is one model, and it involves them taking a much broader view of safety and risk and benefit than they do at the moment? Or do we say, hang on, there must be some mechanism in which the DWP is put in touch with the DFT and there's some kind of decision where the ministers get together in some kind of structure and those considerations are weighed? But if the British system is shockingly fragmented, and if you read the John Cunliffe report on the water industry, it is very powerful on this. The reason why we've ended up with a system that is so suboptimal is nobody was thinking about the system as a whole. Everybody had a narrow remit. And I think, part of our role as Rio has been to broaden the thinking. We can make these points, but ideally I would like some kind of more advanced structure where they were properly weighed. And if someone decides that you should have a more liberal regime for drones, and they take responsibility, we think it's right to have a more liberal regime because of these wider advantages. The regulators, by and large, say that when we talk to them, that they would love to do more on new technology. The problem is they don't have enough money, and they could love to pay for experts who understood it. And again, we don't have deep pockets, but I understand that case, and we can help occasionally. The Food Standards Agency was particularly overwhelmed post-Brexit, and we have put money into them for particular work on novel foods, because we were falling behind clearly in the improving the regulatory regime for those so that decisions were taken faster. I want to allow time for questions, but just two other final points. First, the kind of horizontal issue across regulations, and then secondly, the vertical issue where regulations fit into the long journey from lab to market. So first of all, the horizontal issue. I buy the argument from the experts that you shouldn't regulate a general purpose technology as a technology by and large. You should regulate it by applications. One of the uncomfortable consequences of that is people with a general purpose technology often find there's a whole of different regulators involved in regulating their technology. And there have been attempts. The Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum was, I think, the first one to bring together people broadly in an area so that the regulators themselves collaborate. We have promoted the creation of something recommended strongly by the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee, something similar in engineering biology, synthetic biology, where the meetings comprise 11, at least, different regulators, all having something to do with engineering biology. And as a minimum, there should be a shared access point. There should be a kind of single door, or that at least a regulator who says, we don't think we're the right ones for you, let me pass you on. And there is now a website where the engineering biology group identify the different roles of a range of different regulators with an email and contact address for each one. We can do a lot more. The aim is, as far as possible, regulation should be simultaneous, not sequential. What people hate is you work your way for 18 months, 2 years through one regulator, and then the final message at the end is, right, we'll now pass you on to the HSE or the OPSS or someone. The more that these things can be done at the same time, sharing data, the better. And that's another issue that we are pursuing to try to make progress. Then there is, just sticking with the horizontal approach, one more minute. There's a lot of talk about the regulation of AI. There's much less about AI for regulation. But AI is a very powerful tool that could improve access and flexibility of the regulatory regime. And you just think of the body of regulatory material going into thousands of pages for a key general purpose technology. Looks like a natural for a kind of limited language model application to making it accessible and usable. The starting point is that not all the data, not all these reports are even machine readable at the moment. We have a AI fund which we're using to promote the use of AI amongst regulators, and the Digital Regulators Corporation Forum, who I mentioned earlier, we've granted them £800,000 simply to construct a data library of all the regulations they've got in a machine readable form, which would be the prelude to the proper use of AI so that they can be accessed and interpreted. And then, as I said, the other side of it is vertical. And this, I think, is the right note to end because it ties in so much with a fantastic agenda that Imperial have got. Because I know we're not supposed to think of these things as kind of like a relay race and sequential, but the fact is that it is often a process from the lab out into the marketplace. And certainly regulation comes usually after standards and standard setting. Something else I'm trying to do is inhibit regulators from getting involved too soon. Measurement and the writing of standards is an incredibly productive, valuable process. It's where the UK has great strengths with the reputation of bodies such as the National Physical Laboratory, the British Standards Institute. I was here in this very building earlier this week for the 30th anniversary of UCAS, doing accreditation of standard setting bodies. That is a great ecosystem. And it should be more closely linked to regulation. We should allow the standard setting to happen. And we can learn from the standard setters by having a more iterative process. The first time you draft a regulation, it should not be the last word. It should be easier to amend it as data comes back and there's a better process of feedback. And I have to say, as a parliamentarian, that's where the parliamentary process can be a bit of an issue. It's surprisingly hard once you've done your first draft to keep on changing and updating, and it'd be great if we could. And then I hope after regulation, if an organization has gone through a rigorous regulatory process, there should be a handover on things like public procurement, where we can say this thing has passed some very stringent regulatory tests. Why doesn't the government now start buying some of the product from this company or startup? So I also hope, working with the ministers to whom I report, that we can promote greater links down the chain, especially with departments responsible for large procurement budgets. So I think it's an important agenda. It has very strong backing from senior levels of the government. It is not straightforward. There is a lot to be done, but I was very encouraged by what you guys were saying earlier, and we're absolutely doing our best to deliver this. Thank you very much indeed. Oh yeah, I think now there's a bit of time for any questions or comments or recommendations.
Yes, thank you, David, for that. Chantal from SCI, great to hear. And I think probably, like most people in the room, we were very supportive of the new office that you head up. A lot of what you said resonates really strongly. I think a couple of things just in terms of priorities and how this impacts onto the economy. Do you see the main impact from the office activity coming in spurring startups to scale and innovate and then manufacture in the UK? Or do you see this activity as predominantly helping inward investment, drive inward investment, as others see the opportunity in the UK becoming more, not easier, but a more facilitated, scientifically driven sort of modern regulatory environment? And my second quick, I'm just very intrigued. Are you going to tackle sustainability? Your point about definition and measurement and standards is a really key one. Whenever I talk to people about sustainability, which of course we bandy around, there seems to be no common definition of sustainability. So two questions there. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, to be frank, I haven't got a kind of, I think both your ways in which we could benefit growth are both significant. Part of the information we get is from venture capital investors who are scanning the world, and when they start saying to you, hang on, you do realize that for plant-based protein, we're now shifting to Singapore because you're so far behind. It's messages like that because you want to get you want to act on that kind of information. I think ministers would add something else to your list of benefits quite correctly, which is public services and the quality and cost of public services. If you want to hold down the costs, we need to innovate and make it easier for public services to use these new technologies. And then on sustainability, well, it is in the backdrop, but I will admit it. Look, we are a relatively small team. There's about 30 officials in DSIT. We're carved out as a little unit. And we're still, setting up some of the structures. We're about to launch our proper website, which will have some interactivity, particularly on our 4 priorities. So there's a limit to what we can do there. In fact, what we are thinking, I should have said this earlier, ministers, we're about to be consulting ministers on everything from the second year could comprise working on exactly the same 4 priorities as the first year. We could say for some of them, job done, or job so difficult that we don't think we can crack it without some further support. We could add some new sectors that have got limited capacity, but it could add 1 or 2 more. So another area where I'd be very interested to hear from people and again, works like what's going on at Imperial is what are the key specific areas that we should focus on compared with the 4 we've devoted our first year to.
Lord Willetts, Peter Bannister. So I work with James and Richard on the previous panel, but I'm also working with 2 of the CSEPs on their longer-term operation model with Alistair at Birmingham and Alex Frangi. I also have a role as the Sustainability and Net Zero Chair at the Institution of Engineering and Technology, and I was really enthused as an engineering generalist to help you talk about the possible intersection between health and safety and aviation. The big narrative as we see at the moment is this AI being a source of growth, but also the energy impact of AI.
Right.
Do you see that as a molehill, a mountain, or beyond the remit of where you'd like to see bringing together different departments to come up with a systems view on regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's hard for us to do all of that. I should have said, look, DSIT, I'm located inside DSIT, which is the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, because we have a technology focus, and that's where the government's technology policy people and experts are. DBT is in the overall lead on regulation across government, across business as a whole, and they have that wider focus. We can do work on energy, and let me give you a great example of work done by the Regulatory Horizons Council, which has already been in existence for several years, and with whom we partner really. They do the more strategic stuff, and we get involved in the operationalizing it. But just as how being smart on regulation can help on green energy and growth, they did a report 3 or 4 years ago that comprehensively showed with respectable, proper science that nuclear fusion is fundamentally different from nuclear fission and should not be regulated in the same way. That independent report from a respected body has meant that fusion is not under our normal nuclear regulator. Half of our competitors have made the mistake of saying it's all the same thing. There is a subset of countries that get that fusion is not the same as fission and and don't apply all the fission rules to fusion. Now that's a kind of invisible victory, but the fact that the Regulation Horizons Council wrote a report like that and it was so authoritative that it protected fusion from a nightmare scenario is a great example of smart battles being won. And I have to say, if I may have a grouse here, I don't know if there's anybody here from Lloyd's, the insurance market has not yet accepted that proposal. The insurance market does not insure fusion as if it's different from fission. So sometimes the obstacles are not inside the government process.
Lord Willetts, thank you very much indeed for this. Neil Kermode, working on wave and tidal energy in Orkney, and as a recovering regulator, having worked at the Environment Agency for a number of years, I'd like to encourage more power to your elbow. The point I really wanted to make was if you're looking for an area that really needs some attention. We continuously struggle with the innovation space around the off-gem area, in as much as it falls often below DESNES's jurisdiction and is sort of bit beyond DSIT. And there's a definite gap in there where Ofgem are not really interested in innovation outside of just the sort of the big six. So I would strongly suggest that there's a big opportunity looking at the energy process, because we have to digitise and change our energy system fundamentally.
That's interesting. So two observations, both about energy and its regulation. That is interesting. Okay, yep, helpful. Yes, now where have we got to?
Hi,
Yep.
thank you. I was curious, you talked about restructuring to make sure that you're breaking down silos between regulators, which is really exciting. But I'm also curious about the temporal aspect. So technologies are changing very quickly, and there's a risk that you're regulating technologies of the past by the time you kind of get to defining what the regulation should be. And so is there sort of a thinking about moving towards more dynamic governance?
Well, I mean, oddly enough, in a way, I think what you say about dynamic governance makes sense. And for me, the way I see it is the capacity to amend regulation in the light of new data. And that is, and say at the start and get regulations through and make them publicly acceptable by saying, look, if risks, we can't do the precautionary principle and just try to predict every possible danger and stop it. Instead say, look, some of these things will prove much more beneficial than we thought. Some of them may do damage in a way that nobody has predicted. We will carry on amending how we regulate in the light of new data and new changes in technology. The trouble is, and I have to be so careful on it, but the parliamentary processes, some of this stuff, some regulation is much easier to amend than other regulation. It is surprisingly haphazard. Sometimes you think you've got a terrible regulatory problem and you dig into it and you find it is really just a middle-ranking official in the regulator who's interpreting a very broadly defined term in one sense, and you can persuade the regulator perhaps to interpret this term in a rather different way. Then you can make very rapid progress, and that's in a way, that's an opportunity for flexibility. Other times you find there's a pretty significant regulatory legal block, which makes it hard to be dynamic as you want. My current example of that is when Amazon say to us they want pavement robots to do pavement robots. It does look as if the 1835 Highways Act banning carriages on pavements is interpreted as applying to how Amazon's delivery robots. So we may need to amend the 1835 Highways Act. And when you start, you don't know what you're going to find.
Thanks, Lord Willetts. I'm Owen Jackson from Imperial Policy Forum. You talked about the mechanisms that we might need to provide oversight for some of those system-wide views of regulatory challenge. And you talked about, is there a ministerial committee that can look at and then challenge or overturn a regulatory decision? Are there any existing mechanisms that you think work for that? The one that springs to mind for me is something like the National Screening Committee, where you have a committee that does have to take into account quite a wide array of evidence, is considering right now the evidence on prostate screening, for example. Are there mechanisms that might exist that fall below the kind of threshold of either a ministerial, and you just talked about some of the challenges around parliamentary oversight, that already exists in the system that you think we could mirror in other sectors? Yeah,
that is a very fair point. And to some extent, the NHS model, it's got its pros and its cons, and it's under pressure at the moment. But NICE is a very interesting example. I like it from the procurement perspective, because after you go to one of the few regulators where you've got through the process, there is a clear entitlement then, and indeed a kind of obligation to use the drug that has been approved by NICE. And there are very few regulators that have that kind of follow-up capacity. There is currently a ministerial group that Patrick Vallance chaired, which does try to bring these together. And I think in some areas, I would say in financial services, there is an increasing amount of conversation between the different regulators and a clear attempt to look at the overall benefit, both the benefit for London as a global financial centre and exactly how much risk consumers would face and what the right balance is. So I think that is quite a sophisticated conversation in financial services, going up in certain circumstances to the Minister. But yeah, it is all rather haphazard, and I do think, I mean, we already have good relations with the ministers to whom we report and other ministers in other departments, but the some kind of reporting process for us, I think, would strengthen our arm.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for now for questions, but if everyone could join me in giving a round of applause to Lord Willetts.
Thank you very much.